Now, welcoming up to the stage Danny Roberts. Danny's a veterinary officer from the department. He's had extensive experience in both sheep and cattle, and Danny's going to talk to us about weaners and some of the decisions around that important class of sheep.
I just want to just go over what is natural weaning, if you like, and consider that that process. And basically, from my understanding, there's a strong ewe-lamb bond for the first 90 days of that lamb, and this is despite, while it's driven by the strength of the milk yield drives that bond initially, the bond remains there as the yield drops off. Then after about 100 days, the animals, the separation between the ewe and lamb becomes quite quick. As I said, milk yield is the major determinant of the strength of the bond, and there is a point in time where the ewe decides to do her own self-weaning as a threshold level, and that can occur as early as 55 days of age. And when the ewe decides to wean, it's over a week period, slowly over a period of time, where and generally it can take as long as 135 days when lactation is restricted. So when we're talking about early weaning and times of weaning and that sort of stuff, it's around associated with what's not best for the lamb necessarily. It's how much money can we save feeding the ewe, and that's the main driver for an early weaning versus a late weaning in a dry season. If you are going to lamb wean before day 90, and that's the age of the lamb here, the most important thing is the size of the lamb. It needs to be roughly 10 kilograms, and the other criteria people use is about a minimum of 8 weeks of age. As I said, you're doing the time when it is actually stressful for the ewe and lamb, more stressful than if you waited after day 90 of the age of the lamb. There are certain things you need to do to ensure a successful early weaning, and one of the main ones is to train the lamb to eat the product that you want them to eat after the weaning, be it lupins or pellets. And that means you need to expose it minimum 3 times if it hasn't been exposed during the feeding up until that time. So if it hasn't been exposed to pellets and you want to feed pellets, you need to get pellets to the ewe and lamb before you wean, at least 3 times, ideally 6 times, to allow the lamb to take on the pellet quickly. Otherwise, it's going to take 5 to 10 days before it gets to know what the feed is, and during that time it loses weight because it's not eating as much as it can do. You also need high density, energy density feeds, so you're talking about 11 megajoules, and as Ashley said, you need quite high protein, and the earlier you wean, the higher the protein. So ideally, say 16% would be if you're weaning at 8 weeks, 16 or 18%. And if you are weaning and you've got some green feed, in my opinion, you need at least 1,000 kilograms of dry feed to wean those lambs onto of food, because that at least gives us enough energy to grow slowly. And the other part with lambs is they need good quality water. If I take a June lambing, and you say, well, when's the average lamb born? And generally 50% of the ewes lamb roughly about day 10 in a June lambing. But it can vary between years, between 8 and 18 days. And that determines the distribution of your lambs within that group. If you're an earlier lammer, you might be you might have joined for 8 weeks, and the average birthday may be day 25, and so it makes it much harder to meet the criteria of the 10 kilograms, or 95% of all the lambs to be greater than 10 kilograms at when you wean them. If you move down the time, the average time of marking in a recent study that I've completed was about day 51 after lambing has started. In terms of age of the lamb, that's about day 41 average. using this example here, the weight of those lambs is about 17 kilograms. This is for a crossbred, mixed sex crossbred merino terminal sire lamb. If you're talking about merinos in general, it's about 15% less. The live weight would be about 15% less than that at that particular same age. So that's and so at that time, and then you need to wait at least 3 weeks for the marking process to lambs get over the marking process. If you wait that 3 weeks for these animals, these terminal ones where you're not mulesing, at that stage the average age would be about day 62. So they're above 8 weeks of age, and 98% of lambs would be above 10 kilograms at that particular point in time. So yes, it's possible to wean lambs then, but in terms of actual time frame from when the lambs are when lambing started, that's about 10 weeks. If you're doing mules, if you mule those lambs, you should add another extra week to that, and so that's roughly 11 weeks that merinos could be considered early weaning. We suggest vaccinating and marking those lambs with clostridial disease, cheesy gland, scabby mouth, and that sort of stuff. Generally, the vaccine, the second booster vaccine, given that potentially they're going to be on feed, is going to be 4 weeks later, but you only give them 3 weeks. I don't know how that changed the efficacy of the vaccine, but you know that's one conflict in there. The other, when you do wean, the idea would be to make as homogeneous groups as you can, because that's easier to manage, particularly if they're going into some sort of confinement feeding. And as pointed out, that you should be taking off the tail at a regular basis to sort of manage them separately. When it comes to the worms, this is a result from some of the trials, some of the work I did. Down the bottom here is, one represents lamb marking, 2 is 3 weeks later, and 4 weeks later, 4 weeks later. So that's lamb marking day 51. That's 156 days after the start of lambing there. The two graphs represent one where there was a significant difference in live weight gain in the group that had worm control, worm suppressed versus none, and the green line represents the where there wasn't. But I just wanted to point out that, in other words, worms do take off can take off a considerable amount of live weight gain over time, and remember, these guys are going to have to be in for a period of time to do it. So even at the earliest time, at lamb marking, there is some worms there, and even the amount is may not be that great, and it certainly wouldn't be worth considering drenching. But it's increasing with time, and say if you choose to wean at days 10 weeks after the start of lambing, they have got some worms, so you have to deal with those worms, or within a close time after weaning to deal with those worms, particularly if you're going to feed a high value feed to them. The other way to do it is to go and collect fecal samples from those lambs, see what they are, and it's collecting poo from the lamb, not from the ewe. This is really important. And if they have a high worm air count, then you have to give them an effective drench. If they have a low worm air count, you can maybe hang off for a little time. When I say an effective drench, the main worm that's present in those lambs is the brown stomach worm, and that's the worm that's most resistant to drenches out there. And we're talking about, in most cases, a triple combination drench would be your baseline drench to use on that one. And ideally you would put them onto, if you are going to put them on green feed, put them onto a paddock that is have a low worm burden. And otherwise, if you put them on a paddock that's highly contaminated, within 4 weeks they'll have the same level of worms, and they just continue on where they were before. So how do you grow? You want to grow these animals that are lighter weight up to getting to a finished product or a saleable product. And so if you look at, well, what grows a lamb, how much energy they need, and it's about 10.2 megajoules. They need that much, 18 grams of metabolizable protein. And the growth rate 150 really can be higher, but I'm just using that as a figure there. You need about 1,100 kilograms of really good digestible feed out there to achieve that growth rate. If you don't have if you don't get them onto there when the pasture is starting to decline because it's starting to flower and set seed and things like that, and the digestibility is dropping off and the protein's dropping off, you need much more of the protein, much more of the food there. The alternative is confinement feeding, and I've given 2 rates of feeding there that would achieve the growth rates. You can use, if you were, say, using if the lambs were exposed to lupins beforehand, you keep feeding them lupins afterwards, no problems. There is a time after that you could then consider doing a least cost ration and working out what is a cheaper way of feeding. But that would be secondary. That would have to happen after some period, 2 weeks after the weaning process is finished. You don't want to introduce this additional stress of change of feed, because that could then lead to a reduction in intake. You lose a kilogram here, and as you're trying to keep the lamb growing at 1 kilogram a day, it's minimum. It's very hard. Can be very hard. The other issue is if you're going to use feeders and things like that. These are little tackers. Most of the feeders are designed for adult sheep, and sometimes they just can't get access to these things. So you've got to ensure that they can access the feeders that you're using without restriction. So what I just wanted to look at here was to say, well, I just present some work here. This is growth of merino crossbred lambs on 14 farms from Esperance through to Pingelly, through to Dark and Cojan up, Manjum up, Albany. It's across the white, and the winter growing season on those farms we got information from, and the winter growing seasons from April to October, and in the first 2 years where it's basically average, the winter growing season was the long-term average, the growth rates were similar. In 2015, all but 2 were below average. So the average long-term winter growing season was only 82%. The growth rate of those lambs, measured over the same time period, was less. When you start looking at where did the loss of weight occur, if in the growth rates of those prime lambs from lamb marking to 14 weeks after the start of lambing was not significant between years. It was only after and I presume that's because they had been fed quite well, and the food was between the food and the supplementation, the lamb and the ewe was pretty well adequately met. But once you stop that feeding and rely totally on the food, which is the drier spring, if you want to put it that way, that's when the lamb didn't grow as fast as expected. So the take-home message is that if you are planning to wean earlier, and this is the thing is, when we say earlier, we're talking about most probably, we recommend to wean now at 12, 14 weeks. And most of the producers I dealt with didn't wean until 17 weeks for those terminal sire ones. So when they talk about earlier, they're talking about, I've had some phone calls, they're talking about weaning at 14 weeks. That to them is early. The truth of the matter is others are considering, well, can I wean now, like that timetable I gave you, at 10 weeks? That started getting into, I think the risk, if you go too early, there's too many risks getting it wrong. And what you end up, and if you look at some papers where they compared the weights of animals weaned at 8 weeks versus 14 weeks and measure them later on in time, the 8-week ones, if you don't get it right, will always be lighter at partial senescence, which means you're going to have to feed them more over the summer period to ensure that the survival is adequate. So my message is, yes, you can wean a bit earlier, but it has to be done well. Otherwise, you end up paying later on in summertime.